So while we think of technology as being our primary promoter of total factor productivity in high-income countries, that's generally not the case in low-income countries. Right? First of all, most low-income countries, think Haiti, think Kenya, think Nigeria, think Ghana, right? Think Botswana, Ecuador, Peru. These are, generally speaking, low-income countries. We don't see a lot of total factor productivity coming out of there. We don't see a lot of technology coming out of there. Think about all the wonderful new technology products that you have available to you today. How many of them came out of Africa? How many came out of South America? How many of them came out of Southeast Asia or South Asia? Very few. Very few. So technology is not total factor productivity when we talk about developing countries. In fact, developing countries actually have it easy on the technology side because they can adopt it from the developed countries. You don't have to create cutting-edge new technologies. The developed world is working on all of those things. You don't even need the latest and greatest, right? I mean, if you're in a developing country, you don't need an iPhone 6. You know, chances are an iPhone 5 will work just as fine. Maybe even an iPhone 4 or 3 or 2. No, probably not an iPhone 1. Okay, so we need to think then about total factor productivity not being just technology, but something else. So that's something else, though, we can talk about by going back to our growth accounting formula. And in the growth accounting formula, we simply want to solve for the growth rate of total factor productivity. And notice that what it is how fast the economy is growing minus the contributions that come from the growth rate of the capital stock and the growth rate of the labor force. So another way of thinking about total factor productivity, it is everything over and above the direct contributions of labor and capital that lead to economic growth. Everything other than labor and capital. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. Again, in a developed country, that's going to be largely technology. But in developing countries, it turns out that something else is important, and that's the kind of institutions that the country has. Now, when we talk about institutions, what we're talking about are things like the set of rules. These could be either explicit or implicit. The customs, the practices, in the organizational structure of how business gets done. How do we make exchanges in developing countries? Right? How do we make arrangements in a business sense? Right? Remember, in the production process, output is not generally made immediately. It takes time, right? Production is a process that takes place over time. In order to build something over time, you need inputs from suppliers. The suppliers need to be paid, but your revenue isn't going to change much until you sell the final product. So we need to figure out how all of these arrangements are working out in these developing countries. What we're really talking about is how do we get the economic incentives right? How do we get the economic incentives? Right? So we believe, most of us believe, that individuals, businesses, and governments respond heavily, not exclusively, but heavily to economic incentives. If you get the incentives right, then you have a much better chance of success than if you get those incentives wrong. One way to get the incentives right is through something known as property rights, in particular private property rights. So property rights simply means that a piece of property, the ownership of a piece of property is invested in an individual or in a business or in a family or in a community, whatever it might be. But there is ownership there. And that the owners of that property can make that property rivalrous and excludable to the extent it's not intellectual property, which in developing countries it mostly isn't. Right? So in order to have property rights, especially private property rights, there has to be some way of enforcing those property rights. And it's the enforcement of property rights that leads to either strong or weak economic incentives. When there are weak private property rights, or property rights in general, it means that you have no confidence that your ownership in that property will be respected. In other words, you think that there is a decent chance that somebody's going to come along and take it away from you. It might be the bully on the block. It might be somebody who is higher in the power structure in your community. It might be a bandit. It might be the government. It could be all sorts of different individuals or organizations. Right? How much confidence do you have that the things that you own are actually secure to you? Now, in developed countries, generally speaking, property rights are very strong. This doesn't mean that things are never taken away from you, right? Every now and then somebody gets robbed. Somebody steals a cell phone, car, somebody gets killed. All of those are violation of property rights. So it happens in developed countries. But the extent of that happening in developed countries is much less on average than it is in developing countries. So let's suppose that you have weak property rights. Remember, what this suggests is that you believe that there's a relatively high probability that the stuff you own is going to be taken away from you. If that's the case, do you want to accumulate more and more stuff? Probably not. Right? Well, remember, the stuff that we're talking about here is capital, productive capital, the machines, the buildings to make goods and services with. So if you have weak property rights, bad economic incentives, individuals and firms have a tendency not to accumulate much capital. So the capital to labor ratio will be low. Think about that per worker production function. Very low levels of capital and labor also mean very low levels of income per worker. If it's difficult to accumulate capital because of the institutional structure, lack of security, then you're going to end up with very low capital to labor ratios and very low income per worker. It becomes very difficult to get out of that poverty trap. Now, if you have very strong private property rights, then accumulating capital, which has a rate of return associated with it, has a self-reinforcing mechanism where you want to accumulate more capital to earn a higher rate of return, to have higher return, not necessarily rate of return, so your income per worker would be higher. So that's the real difference that we have here. Now, in order to have strong property rights, there has to be some mechanism for enforcing property rights. Part of that enforcement mechanism is just basic general security, right? A fair and honest police force, stability in the government, stability in the country, where you're pretty sure that the way the country's organized and operated a year from now won't be all that much different than the way it is now, hopefully a little bit better, hopefully not too much worse, but not radically changed. Right? Now, if you think about what's been going on in the world in the last couple of years, you know not everybody lives under those kinds of circumstances. So one needs to have political and social stability, fair and honest policing force, in order to have some confidence that your security is well taken care of. But beyond that, if you're going to run a business, you also need to realize you're going to have customers, you're going to have vendors, you're going to have employees, you're going to be doing all sorts of different types of transactions. You need a way to coordinate agreements between people. So if you're making widgets and you have a customer that wants to buy 12 widgets and take one per month for the next 12 months, you go, that's great, that fits with my current production schedule. I'll deliver, you pay, or sometimes you pay half ahead of time and half on delivery. Right? If you're going to do all of those kinds of things, you want a contract. The contract may be implicit, that is not written down. So it may be just done on a handshake if you know the person really well. And but it may be explicit, right? We've got a written contract. This says I will deliver to you one widget each month for the next 12 months, and you will pay me X number of dollars for each of those widgets. Right? You want to have that contract. Notice lots of transactions involve contracts, some of which are explicit, written down, many of which are not. For instance, I have a contract with the university. It's an implicit contract. I do not have a written piece of paper that both the university signed and I signed. But our implicit contract is that I will come here twice a week and teach you, and occasionally the university will put some money in my checking account. Right? So it's an implicit contract. Most employment contracts are implicit. Right? And the university also has this whole set of stuff back there that is explicit. It says, by the way, if you do all of these things, you're fired. Don't worry, it won't happen before next Tuesday. Or maybe you should worry because it won't happen before next Tuesday. So there are all sorts of contracts. Now, remember, we're delivering widgets to the supplier. And all the widgets we made were black widgets, but our customer wanted red widgets. But it's not in contract what color it was. But now we've got a disagreement. Well, if you're not going to give me red widgets, I'm not going to pay you. Okay? Now, how do we adjudicate that dispute? Now, remember, we want stability, so we don't want anybody going half-cocked and get into a big, violent situation. So in order to maintain that stability, to adjudicate that dispute, we need to have some sort of an effective legal system. Right? We need lawyers to draw and interpret contracts. We need judges to adjudicate disputes. We need a legal system that can quickly, effectively, and fairly work through the kinds of disagreements that we have in businesses. These things largely exist in developed countries, which is why technology is the most important factor for total factor productivity. This is often missing in developing countries, and therefore, even if they were to adopt the technologies from developed countries, they would still have low total factor productivity because the economic incentives for accumulating capital are very weak. So property rights becomes very important. Finally, we have some other obstacles that take place here. So one of the obstacles is simply this notion of how easy is it to start a new business. So this goes back to the conversation that we had earlier, right, where you want a lot of businesses to be started because you have no idea which ones are going to be the winner. But you know the probability of the winner is actually relatively small. So by having a lot of new businesses start up, some of those might become winners. The World Bank looks at every country in the world and ranks them on their ease of starting a new business, reflecting both the bureaucratic process, the paperwork and applications, as well as the cost of doing so. When I looked at this a couple of years ago, the easiest country in the world to start a new business in was New Zealand. In New Zealand at that time, it cost 24 hours, took 24 hours and cost $25. That's 25 New Zealand dollars, not 25 US dollars. Lots and lots of new businesses get started in New Zealand. At the other end of the spectrum was Ghana. In Ghana, it took 325 business days. Remember, there's only 220 business days in a year, so we're talking beyond 18 months, and the equivalent of 18 months' income to start a new business. Not very many new businesses, or at least legal new businesses, get started in Ghana. And remember, if you're going to start, you've got that entrepreneurial spirit, you want to have your own company. If it's really expensive to do so, now you start your business anyway, right? But now you're an illegal business. Your property rights probably aren't all that strong. You're working in a country where court system may not be all that wonderful. If you're operating that kind of company, you don't want to get too big, right? Because the bigger you get, the more obvious you become. And when you get really big and the government says, oh, look at that company. I don't see it in the records anywhere. I'm sure they owe us a lot of taxes. In fact, they probably owe us so much in taxes, I think we'll just take the company over. Okay? It happens. The second problem, corruption. Right? Corruption, as we know, raises the cost of every transaction where corruption takes place. In fact, it even raises the cost of the transactions downstream from the corruption. So the greater the corruption that there is in the economy, the higher the cost of doing business, the less business gets done. The less capital gets created, capital-labor ratio stays small, income per worker stays small. And finally, we have a couple of countries that are sometimes referred to as kleptocracies. These are those situations where the government finally says, I don't like you, so I'm going to come and take all your property. And you're more than welcome to leave, or not, because we may throw you in jail. So Russia has gone through a period recently where they've been referred to as a kleptocracy, where the government's gone in and arrested people who have been very successful businessmen, thrown them in jail, after a trial, of course, thrown them in jail, and then the government has seized their businesses. Zimbabwe, which we'll talk more about on Thursday, is another example of a kleptocracy, where the government came in and told certain farmers that your presence in our country is no longer welcome. Please turn your farm over to the government, and we would appreciate it if you would leave. Not a really good situation for developing new businesses. Okay, so have a good evening. I will see you on Thursday, where we will talk a little bit more about exam number 1.